I'll make him an offer he can't refuse. That's just one of the many iconic, quotable lines from The Godfather. But I'm not talking about the pop culture juggernaut that is Francis Ford Coppola's film. I'm talking about the book by writer Mario Puzo. The Godfather was published in 1969, but with the film version following just 3 years later, the original story often gets lost in the cultural zeitgeist. But echoes of The Godfather in both the film and the page linger all over New York, where much of the story takes place. And joining me now to help separate the film from the book, from some of the real-life people that inspired Puzo's timeless characters, is Eric Ferrara, founder of the Lower East Side History Project and guide to its Mafia walking tour. Eric, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, of course, I quoted one of the most famous, or what I think is one of the most famous lines, but so many people will quote The Godfather, you know, leave the gun, take the cannolis, etc. Yes. And we consider ourselves to be maybe experts from having seen the movie over and over and over again. But what is it about the actual book that Puzo wrote that we're missing from having just seen the movie?
The truth is, there's not a lot of accuracy about what the real-life mafia is like in the book. There's a lot of inconsistencies. There's certain examples, like when Vito Corleone kills the boss of the neighborhood, which was La Mano Nera, the Black Hand back then, before it was actually known as the Mafia. That was the foundation of what became the Mafia in America. You don't just become boss next day. You know, there was 20 other guys in line waiting for that position.
What we know as Godfather Part 1 and Godfather Part 2 are actually just The Godfather, the book.
Yeah, most of that was compiled in the actual 1969 book, and they split it into 2 movies, more or less.
Of course, in The Godfather Part 2, we're taken all the way back to when Vito Andolini first comes to America, and that's a very different New York.
Godfather 2 is my favorite, actually. It's amazing how they reproduce New York City during that time period. But you have to realize by the time that they get to in the Godfather 1 series, it's the 1940s and 50s. They're just coming out of Prohibition, which everybody was making money. So now all of a sudden a multi-billion-dollar industry essentially is taken away, and the mob is fighting for different illegal activities all over the country. So that's what that kind of portrays, that war over everything from illegal drugs, gambling, loan sharking, and all sorts of activities that they were involved in during that time period. And that gives you, the story really does give you a good essence of what that was about during that time period.
Puzo would have been writing this book in the 60s or so. Can you take us to what at least the New York that he most likely would have been experiencing, that he might have seen of his own eyes? Because I understand he's from the meatpacking district.
He is. He's not too far from here.
Yeah.
Well, by the late 1960s, the mob was already pretty well established. The 5 families had their territories. It was all kind of, you know, it was a little bit less conflict that would started happening in the early 1970s and 80s going into the 1990s. So he got to see a mob basically at their peak, I would say, by the late 1960s. Everything was laid out. All the territories were laid out. The activities that they were involved in were really established. And so I think he got to get a good glimpse at what was going on during that time period.
Was his portrayal, Puzo's portrayal of the Corleone family and the people that existed in their orbit, was that true to form?
I would say not so much. Like, I think the general public, because of The Godfather, believes that the organized crime, Italian organized crime in America is based on bloodlines and lineage. And that really doesn't happen. It's more based on initiation. There's very few examples I can think of historically where fathers made guys want their sons to get involved in family business. So when they talk about, like today, the 5 families, I'm not going to mention names, but you don't have to be named after the family. It's basically by initiation. There's very few examples in history of multi-generational made guys.
New York is one of those cities that's constantly changing, and so very little of what we see of New York now, specifically those neighborhoods where the movie took place.
There's not much left that hasn't been completely renovated. I would say you walk down to Old St. Patrick's Cathedral on Prince and Mulberry Street. That was the altar scene at the end of Godfather 1. You have Duo Theater, I believe, on East 4th Street, where the famous operetta scene was filmed. That's just almost a century-old theater that's still pretty much intact from the time of the movie.
Eric, I want to thank you so much for joining us on the program and giving us some background into what we all assume is, well, we just take what we saw in the movie, but there's so much more to the story.
There's a lot more that we can wrap up in the few minutes that we have.
Exactly.
Yes, thank you for having me.
But thank you for coming.